Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're new here, grab a pillow, turn the lights down a little, maybe pull the blanket up just slightly higher than you need to, and let's just drift. Tonight we're going back, a long way back, all the way to the city that for about 500 years convinced itself, and honestly most of the known world, that it had figured everything out. We're going to ancient Rome. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Rome, that sounds exciting. Gladiators, conquest, marble columns. And sure, yes, there was some of that. But what we're focusing on tonight is the quieter, stranger, more deeply human side of Rome. The emperors who couldn't sleep without their astrologers. The senators who spent entire careers being afraid of the wrong person. The everyday Romans who lived in 6-story apartment buildings made of wood and prayed nightly that nobody on the ground floor had knocked over a candle. Rome was magnificent and exhausting in equal measure. It was a city of about 1 million people at its peak, which for the ancient world was an almost incomprehensible number, and somehow most of them managed to be anxious, underfed, and highly opinionated all at once, which, when you think about it, is not that different from living in any major city today. So, settle in. Let's wander through the streets together. We'll begin, as most things in Rome begin, with a little bit of ambition and a lot of dysfunction. The city of Rome, according to Roman tradition, was founded in 753 BCE by a man named Romulus, who, if the legends are to be believed, was raised by a wolf, killed his own brother over a disagreement about city walls, and then promptly disappeared one afternoon in a thunderstorm and was declared a god, which is one way to retire. Most historians today think the founding myth is, shall we say, embellished. But the Romans believed it wholeheartedly, and that belief shaped almost everything about the way they thought of themselves for the next 1,000 years. The Romans had a deep, almost touching conviction that they were special, chosen, destined, that the gods, particularly Jupiter, who was essentially Zeus but with better real estate, had specifically selected this one marshy, malarial cluster of hills along the Tiber River as the center of civilization. And for a while, in fairness to them, the evidence seemed to support it. Rome kept winning. Rome kept expanding. Rome kept building roads and aqueducts and amphitheaters and legal codes and eventually concrete, which is perhaps the most Roman invention of all, practical, durable, and used primarily to cover things up. But tonight, we're not here for Rome's greatest hits. We're here for the quieter stories, the strange ones, the ones that reveal what it was actually like to live inside the most powerful empire the Western world had ever seen. So, let's start with something simple. Let's start with housing. If you were a wealthy Roman, a senator, say, or a successful merchant, you lived in a domus, a private house, usually built around a central courtyard open to the sky, with a shallow pool to collect rainwater, frescoes on the walls, and a garden in the back that you almost certainly bragged about constantly. The domus was a statement. It said, "I have arrived. I have space. My floors are mosaic, and yours are not." But most Romans did not live in a domus. Most Romans lived in an insula, and an insula was, to put it gently, a very different experience. An insula was a Roman apartment building. They could be 6, 7, sometimes 8 stories tall. The ground floor was usually commercial, shops, taverns, bakeries, and as you went higher, the apartments got smaller, and the rent got cheaper, and the general quality of existence got progressively more precarious. By the top floor, you were essentially living in a wooden box perched above a stone structure, with no running water, no kitchen to speak of, no heat in winter except a small brazier that itself was a fire hazard, and a long, long walk down to the communal latrine on the street level, every morning. The Roman author Juvenal, who was essentially the ancient world's most irritable columnist, complained extensively about insula life. He wrote about the constant noise, the carts that were only allowed into the city at night rumbling over cobblestones at 3 in the morning, the danger of things falling from upper floor windows, which included not just water but also sometimes chamber pots, because not everyone wanted to make the journey downstairs at midnight. He complained about fires, which were a genuine and recurring catastrophe. Rome burned so frequently and so enthusiastically that the Emperor Augustus eventually established the vigiles, a sort of combined night watch and fire brigade, specifically to deal with this problem. The vigiles had about 7,000 men at their peak. Rome still burned regularly. Some things are simply bigger than their solutions. But let's not linger too long in the apartments. Let's drift down to street level, where the city is truly alive, or, at this hour, beginning to settle into something like sleep. The streets of Rome were narrow and loud, and smelled, according to every ancient account, quite powerfully of a number of things we won't enumerate in detail. The city had no real garbage collection. It had street vendors selling food at all hours, hot sausages, flatbreads, wine mixed with water, because uncut wine was considered uncouth and also somewhat dangerous, which says everything you need to know about ancient Roman wine. There were fountains everywhere, fed by the aqueducts, and Romans gathered at them constantly because the fountains were essentially the public water supply for everyone who didn't have a private connection, which was most people. Getting a private water pipe connected to your home required a permit from the emperor's office and a fairly substantial bribe, and even then, the water sometimes arrived and sometimes didn't, depending on who had been more recently bribed up the chain. Rome was, underneath all its grandeur, a city held together by a combination of engineering genius and relentless, cheerful corruption. Let's talk about food for a moment, because Roman food is one of those topics that reveals a great deal about Roman priorities, which were complex and sometimes alarming. The wealthy Romans ate extraordinarily elaborate meals. We know this partly from the cookbook of Apicius, a first-century collection of recipes that reads like someone sat down and asked, "What if we made everything more complicated and also added fish sauce to it?" Because the Romans loved garum, a fermented fish sauce produced by layering fish and salt in large pots and leaving them in the sun for several months, and they put it on nearly everything.
Garum was their soy sauce, their Worcestershire, their everything bagel seasoning. It was strong and pungent, and the Romans used it with the serene confidence of people who have simply decided that this is what food tastes like, and further discussion is unnecessary. The very wealthy ate dishes like dormice rolled in honey and poppy seeds, dormice being small rodents that were specially fattened in clay pots called gliraria, because of course that's a thing that existed, and elaborate seafood preparations and roasted peacock, and sow's wombs stuffed with various things we will charitably describe as offal. The Roman elite had a talent for turning the act of eating into a competitive sport, which is perhaps why the Romans also invented the concept of the vomitorium. Although, and this is worth noting, vomitoria were actually just the passageways in an amphitheater through which crowds could exit quickly. The idea that Romans had designated rooms for purging between courses is mostly a myth. Mostly. Some individual Romans certainly did this, but it wasn't the architectural institution that popular history suggests. The poor Romans, meanwhile, ate bread. A lot of bread. The grain dole, the annona, was one of the foundational social programs of the Roman state, providing free or subsidized grain to a significant portion of the Roman citizenry. At various points, somewhere between 150,000 and 320,000 Romans received the grain dole. This was not charity in any modern sense, it was policy. A hungry urban population was an unstable one, and Roman politicians had learned this lesson several times, usually the hard way. The phrase bread and circuses, panem et circenses, comes from the poet Juvenal, again, who used it sarcastically to describe how the Roman people had supposedly traded their political engagement for free food and entertainment. Whether or not this was entirely fair is a debate that historians have been having for roughly 2,000 years and will presumably continue having indefinitely. But speaking of circuses, let's drift toward the entertainment, because Roman entertainment is where things get genuinely strange in a quiet, slow-burn, deeply revealing sort of way. The Romans loved spectacle. This is well documented and not particularly controversial. What is perhaps more interesting is the specific texture of their relationship with spectacle, the way it wove itself into politics, religion, identity, and the daily rhythm of city life in ways that are hard to fully separate from one another. The Colosseum, or the Flavian Amphitheater to use its proper name, could seat between 50 and 80,000 people, depending on whose estimates you trust, and hosted events that ranged from gladiatorial combat to wild animal hunts to naval battles when they filled the floor with water, which they apparently did at least occasionally, and which must have been an extraordinary logistical undertaking.
The Circus Maximus, for chariot racing, could hold somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000 spectators, which made it larger than most modern sports venues and essentially the ancient world's equivalent of a major stadium, except that it also occasionally caught fire, and the chariot races themselves had a fatality rate that would be considered unacceptable in any modern motorsport context, and the crowd took the whole thing with a tribal intensity that makes modern football rivalries look mild. Romans divided themselves into chariot racing factions, the blues, the greens, the reds, and the whites, with a passion that transcended sport. People were blues fans the way people are sometimes fans of political parties today, or perhaps more accurately, the way people are fans of political parties combined with a religion, combined with a street gang. There were riots over chariot racing outcomes. Emperors had favorite factions and were known to show favoritism accordingly, which was politically significant and also deeply undignified in the best possible way. But let's talk about the emperors themselves for a while, because no tour of ancient Rome is complete without at least a gentle wander through the imperial palace and a look at the extraordinary collection of human beings who, for about 5 centuries, held more or less absolute power over a significant portion of humanity. The Roman Empire officially began in 27 BCE, when a young man named Octavian, the adopted heir of Julius Caesar, great-nephew and political successor, became Augustus, the first emperor. He was careful never to call himself a king, because Romans had a powerful historical allergy to kings, having expelled their last one roughly 500 years ago with considerable enthusiasm. Instead, Augustus called himself the first citizen, princeps, and accumulated power through a series of republican-sounding titles and offices that, taken together, added up to something functionally indistinguishable from absolute monarchy. It was a remarkably elegant bit of political theater. Augustus was, by almost any measure, one of the most successful rulers in human history. He reigned for 45 years. He transformed Rome from a city of brick, allegedly, to a city of marble. He established the Pax Romana, a period of relative peace and stability that would last for, with occasional interruptions, for about 2 centuries. He reformed the army, the tax system, the postal service, the fire brigade, the grain supply. He was, to use a word the Romans would have understood, formidable. He was also, according to the historian Suetonius, deeply superstitious, afraid of thunder, and so personally modest in his lifestyle that he wore clothes made by his wife and daughter rather than imported luxury fabrics. He slept badly, he ate very little, he was known to carry around a piece of sealskin as a charm against lightning, which is the kind of detail that makes a world historical figure feel suddenly, unexpectedly human. Augustus had one daughter, Julia, whom he loved, apparently, in the particular way of Roman fathers, which is to say, as an asset to be managed and deployed for political purposes. Julia was married off 3 times. Her first husband died. Her second husband was Augustus's right-hand general, Agrippa, who was significantly older than her and with whom she had 5 children before he also died. Her third husband was Tiberius, Augustus's stepson, who, we will get to Tiberius, did not go well. Julia herself was, by ancient account, witty, charming, and spectacularly unbothered by the sexual conventions her father kept trying to impose on her. She reportedly said, when asked how she managed to have children who all resembled Agrippa, despite her rumored infidelities, that she only took passengers when the ship was already loaded, which is either a very funny joke or a very frank admission, and possibly both. Augustus eventually exiled her to a small island, which is the Roman equivalent of a timeout, except that it was permanent and she was not allowed back. Now, Tiberius. Tiberius was Augustus's successor, and he is one of those historical figures who defies easy summary because the sources are conflicting, and the man himself seems to be genuinely, deeply, and somewhat tragically complicated. He was a capable general, he was an effective administrator, he was also apparently deeply unhappy for most of his adult life, and this unhappiness found expression in a reign that started well and then gradually went somewhere quite dark and quiet and strange. Tiberius did not want to be emperor, or at least he claimed not to want to be emperor, which the senators interpreted as false modesty and enthusiastically confirmed him anyway. There is a story, possibly apocryphal but perfectly calibrated, that as the senators were confirming his accession, Tiberius kept saying things like, But this is such an enormous burden, and I am not sure I am equal to this task," until one frustrated senator muttered, "Either let him rule or let him go," which is the ancient Roman equivalent of telling someone to just order their coffee already. Tiberius ruled for 23 years and spent the last 11 of them on the island of Capri, essentially retired, leaving Rome to be governed by a man named Sejanus, who was the prefect of the Praetorian Guard and who ran an increasingly brutal terror campaign against senators and aristocrats, while Tiberius sat on his island and, if Suetonius is to be believed, engaged in various private behaviors that the historian describes with a level of detail that suggests he either had very good sources or a very active imagination. Modern historians tend to view Suetonius's more salacious claims about Tiberius and about several other emperors with some skepticism. Suetonius was writing under the Antonine emperors, safely removed from the Julio-Claudians, and there was a long Roman tradition of retrospectively blackening the reputations of emperors who were already dead and safely unable to object. This doesn't mean the scandals are all invented. It means we should hold them lightly, the way you'd hold a Roman fish sauce amphora, carefully and with awareness that the smell may not be entirely what you expected. Tiberius eventually became aware that Sejanus was plotting against him, or at least someone told him this, possibly to advance their own agenda, and had Sejanus arrested and executed in 31 CE with a speed and thoroughness that suggested Tiberius had not entirely lost his edge on Capri. Then Tiberius went back to Capri and died there in 37 CE, and his death was reportedly mourned by the Roman people with something close to festivity. His successor was his great-nephew, Gaius, better known by his nickname, Caligula. Let's take a breath here. Let's settle in. Caligula is one of those names that carries enormous weight in the popular imagination, and most of that weight consists of the assumption that he was simply, straightforwardly insane. The reality, as usual, is more textured, and also somehow both better and worse. Caligula started well. He was young, only 24 when he became emperor, and charming and popular, and the Roman people, exhausted by Tiberius's long, grim reign, greeted him with genuine enthusiasm. He gave out cash gifts, he recalled exiles, he abolished some of the more oppressive treason trials. For about 8 months, everyone was quite pleased. Then something changed. Historians debate what. Some say illness. Caligula was seriously sick early in his reign and may never have fully recovered. Some say the experience of absolute power simply did what absolute power tends to do to people who receive it at 24 with no meaningful constraints. Some say the ancient sources exaggerated wildly, and Caligula was, in practice, no worse than several other emperors, just more dramatic about it. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Caligula's reign from about 38 CE onward was marked by erratic behavior, paranoia, the execution of people on charges that were sometimes thin and sometimes non-existent, a spectacular disregard for senatorial dignity, and a tendency to spend money at a rate that alarmed even the Roman treasury. He was assassinated in 41 CE by members of his own guard, who had apparently grown tired of the whole situation, and replaced by his uncle Claudius, who was found hiding behind a curtain in the palace, which is the least imperial beginning to an imperial reign in Roman history. Claudius is in many ways the most interesting emperor to spend time with, which is fitting because spending time with him was apparently something most Romans had avoided doing throughout his adult life. He had a limp, he stuttered, he drooled under stress. His own mother reportedly referred to him as a monster of a man and used him as her benchmark for stupidity, as in, only someone as foolish as Claudius would do that, which is a devastating thing to say about your child in any era, and perhaps explains some of Claudius's later life choices. Because Claudius, hidden away and dismissed by basically everyone who knew him, had spent decades reading. He had become a genuine scholar of Roman history, of Etruscan language and culture, of Carthaginian history. He wrote books. He invented 3 new letters for the Latin alphabet, which were used during his reign and then promptly abandoned after his death, because the Romans were nothing if not efficient at discarding the enthusiasms of dead emperors. As emperor, Claudius was actually quite capable. He successfully invaded Britain in 43 CE, which had eluded Julius Caesar and every subsequent emperor. He
He expanded Roman citizenship. He built a new harbor at Ostia to improve Rome's grain supply. He reformed the imperial bureaucracy. He was, in administrative terms, a competent and sometimes inspired ruler. He was also, unfortunately, extremely bad at choosing wives. Claudius was married 4 times. His first 2 marriages ended in divorce. His third wife, Messalina, was young, beautiful, and conducted herself with an independence that the Roman sources found either scandalous or remarkable, depending on the source. She reportedly took lovers openly and brazenly in ways that would have been unremarkable in a man, but were considered deeply transgressive in a woman of her position. She was eventually executed in 48 CE under circumstances that remain somewhat murky, though the official version involved a secret marriage to another man while Claudius was still alive, which was either a genuine conspiracy or a very effective frame-up. His fourth wife was his niece, Agrippina the Younger, whom he married after having the law against uncle-niece marriages specifically amended, because when you're emperor, you can do things like that. Agrippina was the mother of Nero from a previous marriage, and she had a plan. The plan was to get Claudius to adopt Nero as his heir, and then, at some appropriate moment, to ensure that Claudius did not remain emperor long enough to change his mind. Claudius died in 54 CE, probably of poisoned mushrooms, and the ancient sources are relatively united in pointing at Agrippina, though proof, naturally, is elusive. Proof tends to be elusive when the person who would most benefit from someone's death is also the person best positioned to ensure that no evidence survives. Nero became emperor at 16. He was, in his early years, guided by his mother and by his tutor, Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, who wrote extensively about virtue, moderation, and the importance of living simply, while simultaneously accumulating one of the largest personal fortunes in Rome, which is an irony that even Seneca's philosophical system seems to have trouble fully resolving. Nero's early reign was considered the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5 good years, a period of mild, relatively competent governance during which most people were fine. Then things, as they had a habit of doing in Rome, changed. Nero had his mother killed in 59 CE. This is in dispute. The circumstances are somewhat disputed. The ancient sources describe a comically elaborate failed attempt involving a collapsible boat designed to sink and drown her, which instead just deposited a wet and irritated Agrippina on the shore of the Bay of Naples, after which Nero had to resort to simply sending men to stab her. Then Nero went back to Capri and died there in 37 CE, and his death was reportedly mourned by the Roman people with something close to festivity.
Octavia exiled and executed on fabricated charges so he could marry his mistress Poppaea. He had Seneca forced to commit suicide. He had his advisor Burrus poisoned. He had the former general Corbulo recalled from an extremely successful military command and handed a sword as an invitation to do the same. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, which burned for 6 days, destroyed or damaged 10 of the city's 14 districts, and left hundreds of thousands of Romans homeless, became attached to Nero's name in one of history's most persistent rumors. He did not, in any provable historical sense, fiddle while Rome burned. Fiddles hadn't been invented. He was also not in Rome when the fire started, but he did subsequently build an enormous palace complex, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, on land that the fire had conveniently cleared, which is the kind of thing that makes people suspicious even across 2 millennia. Nero eventually fled Rome in 68 CE, as provincial governors rose against him and the Senate declared him an enemy of the state. He is reported to have died by suicide with the help of a secretary, his last words recorded, possibly invented, as, "What an artist dies in me," which is exactly the thing you would make up for Nero if you were making things up, and also possibly exactly the thing Nero would have said, because Nero was, sincerely and somewhat touchingly, convinced of his artistic genius. He sang, he performed on stage, he competed in the Greek games at which he won every competition he entered, because when you are the emperor, the judges are very sensible about the outcomes of competitions. He was 28 years old when he died. He had been emperor for 14 years, and with him died the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the family of Augustus, through all its twisted adoptions and strategic marriages and remarkable collection of difficult personalities.
and Rome entered a brief, violent period known as the Year of the Four Emperors, during which the empire demonstrated that it could survive almost anything, including having 4 different men declare themselves emperor within 12 months, 3 of whom were dead before the year was out. Let's drift forward a little. Let's skip lightly over the chaos and land somewhere slightly more stable. There is a period in Roman history that the 18th century historian Edward Gibbon called the period of maximum happiness for humanity, which is a bold claim even for a historian writing with the enthusiasm of the Enlightenment. He was referring to the reigns of Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, who ruled roughly from 96 to 180 CE and who are collectively known as the 5 good emperors. The thing that distinguished them, Gibbon argued, was that each one chose his successor based on merit rather than blood, adopting talented men from outside the immediate family rather than defaulting to whatever unfortunate child the empress happened to have produced. This is, in principle, an elegant idea. In practice, it was aided considerably by the fact that several of these emperors simply didn't have sons, which makes it somewhat easier to be principled about succession. Trajan is perhaps the easiest of them to discuss in a calm, drowsy tone, because Trajan was genuinely, straightforwardly successful in ways that are almost restful to contemplate. He conquered Dacia, modern Romania, in 2 campaigns, which expanded the empire, brought in enormous amounts of silver and gold from the Dacian mines, provided enough resources to build Trajan's Column and Trajan's Forum and Trajan's Market, and is celebrated to this day on that column through a continuous spiral frieze that winds up the shaft like the world's longest ancient comic strip. He was generous. He was publicly accessible. He was, by almost all ancient accounts, a fairly decent person to be around, which is rarer among emperors than you might hope. Hadrian is more interesting in the way that complicated people are more interesting than straightforward ones. He traveled constantly, more than any other emperor, visiting nearly every province of the empire during his reign. He built things everywhere he went. He built a wall across northern Britain, which you may have heard of, primarily to define and defend the northern limit of Roman territory, though also perhaps because Hadrian was the kind of person who, when he arrived somewhere, immediately wanted to build something permanent to mark the occasion. He had an intensely close relationship with a young Greek man named Antinous, who drowned in the Nile in 130 CE under circumstances that were never clearly explained. Hadrian's grief was, by all accounts, extravagant and sincere. He founded a city in Egypt named Antinopolis at the site of the drowning, had Antinous declared a god, as was the imperial prerogative for people the emperor was fond of, and had statues of him placed throughout the empire. Hundreds of these statues survive, making Antinous one of the most represented individuals from the ancient world in modern museum collections, which is one of the stranger monuments to grief that history has produced. Marcus Aurelius is the one who has aged best into popular consciousness, possibly because he wrote a book, The Meditations, which was not written for publication, but rather as a private journal of philosophical self-examination, and which reads with an intimacy and a kind of gentle, persistent struggle toward virtue that feels remarkably present across nearly 19 centuries. He was a Stoic. He believed in duty. He believed in doing the right thing regardless of whether it made you happy, which is both admirable and somewhat exhausting as a life philosophy. He spent a significant portion of his reign on the Danube frontier, fighting the Marcomannic Wars, a long, grinding series of conflicts against Germanic and other northern peoples who were pressing against the Roman borders. He wrote his meditations during these campaigns, sitting in a military tent somewhere on the edge of the empire, reminding himself to be patient, to focus on what he could control, to treat others with fairness, and to remember that he was mortal and that his reign and everything he'd built would eventually pass away and be forgotten. He was right about that. He was right about almost everything in the Meditations. And then he named his biological son Commodus as his successor, which is the one significant decision that most historians consider a catastrophe, because Commodus was not, under any reasonable definition, a good emperor. He renamed Rome after himself. He renamed the months after himself. He was convinced he was the reincarnation of Hercules and dressed accordingly, wearing a lion skin and carrying a club,
which was not the look that the Senate found entirely dignified. He fought in the gladiatorial arena, always winning because his opponents were either given blunted weapons or had very strong professional instincts about how these matches should end. He was strangled in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus in 192 CE, hired for the purpose by people who had grown, understandably, tired of the whole situation. Rome did not collapse. Rome, at this point, had been managing imperial dysfunction for over 2 centuries and had developed a remarkable institutional resilience. Emperors came and went, the army, the bureaucracy, the aqueducts, the grain supply, the courts. These kept functioning, more or less, because they had developed their own momentum.
Interests and their own ways of continuing to exist regardless of what was happening at the top. This is perhaps the most important and least dramatic thing to understand about Rome, that for all the vivid, memorable chaos of individual emperors, the empire as a system was extraordinarily durable. It absorbed Caligula. It absorbed Nero. It absorbed Commodus. It kept going. It would keep going for another 3 centuries after Commodus, through military anarchy and civil war and economic crisis and the rise of Christianity and the first serious Gothic incursions and countless other challenges, until finally, in 476 CE, the last emperor of the Western Empire, a 16-year-old boy with the ironic name Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus, was simply told by a Germanic general named Odoacer to step down, and did so, and retired to a villa in Campania. And that, more or less, was the end of that particular chapter. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's drift back to the streets, back to the ordinary texture of Roman life, which is where the real sleep-inducing magic lives.